Hello everyone, good day. I am Chryzena Reyes, and together with my partner Karl Gelbolingo, we are here to discuss about Melanie Klein's Object Relations Theory. But before we dive into the theory and the concept itself, let us first discuss and find out who really is Melanie Reyes Klein. Feelings of love and gratitude arise directly and spontaneously in the baby in response to the love and care of his mother. That is a statement from Melanie Klein. Melanie Reyes Klein was born on the 30th day of March 1882 in Vienna, Austria. She was the youngest of four children born to Dr. Moritz Reyes and his second wife Libusa Deutsch Reyes. As a young child, she believed that her birth was unexpected and unplanned. This, of course, led to her feelings of being rejected by her parents, especially by her father, who greatly adored his oldest daughter, Emily. During her childhood, Klein observed both parents working at jobs they did not enjoy. Her father struggled to make ends meet as a physician and was eventually relegated to working as a dental assistant. Her mother, on the other hand, ran a plant and reptile shop, which greatly humiliated and scared her as someone who abhorred snakes. Despite witnessing her father's low income as a doctor, she still aspired to one day become a physician. Klein's early relationships were either unhealthy or ended in tragedy. One prime example is her being distant from her father, and although she loved and idolized her mother, Klein felt suffocated by her. As a result of her feelings of rejection from her parents, she developed a special fondness for her older sister Sidonie, who taught Klein how to read and how to do arithmetics. However, when Klein was only 4 years old, Sidonie passed away. This devastated her, and she even confessed that she never got over mourning for Sidonie. After her death, Klein became deeply attached to her only brother, Emmanuel, and became her close companion. He tutored her like what Sidonie used to do, and his excellent tutoring made it possible for Klein to pass the entrance examinations of a reputable preparatory school. When she was 18, her father, Dr. Morris, passed away, and then 2 years later, Emmanuel, her close confidant and brother, followed soon after. Arthur Klein is an engineer and a close friend of Emmanuel. Melanie married him while still mourning. Her marriage at age 21 led her to believe that it is the reason that prevented her from becoming a physician, and for the rest of her life regretted it that she had not reached her goal. However, Klein did not have a happy marriage. She dreaded intercourse and abhorred pregnancy. But nevertheless, her marriage to Arthur gave birth to 3 children, and they are Melita, born in 1904, Hans, born in 1907, and Erich, born in 1914. In 1909, the Klein's family moved to Budapest, where Arthur had been transferred. There, Melanie met Sandor Ferenczi, a member of Freud's inner circle and the person who introduced her into the world of psychoanalysis. Her mother's eventual death led her to depression and therefore had undergone analysis with Ferenczi. That very same year, she read On Dreams by Freud and was immediately hooked. Because of her fascination for Freud and his ideas, she began psychoanalyzing her own son, Erich, and trained him according to Freudian principles. During this time as well, she also attempted to psychoanalyze Melita and Hans, but they eventually went to other psychoanalysts. Karen Horney and others became Melita's psychoanalysts, and what's interesting is Melanie became the psychoanalyst for Horney's 2 youngest daughters when they were still 12 and 9 years old. In 1919, Klein eventually separated from her husband and obtained divorce several years later. She established a psychoanalytic practice in Berlin and made a paper dealing with her analysis of Erich. However, the information that the child in her psychoanalysis paper was in fact her son Erich was not known until her death. Moreover, Melanie, who was unsatisfied with her own analysis, ended her professional relationship with Ferenczi and began working with Karl Abraham instead, who, like Ferenczi, is a member of Freud's inner circle. However, 14 months after working with him, another tragedy befell upon her. Karl Abraham had died. Due to this, she decided to begin self-analysis, and this continued for the remainder of her life. While Freud's theories on the development of children were based on his therapeutic work with adults, Klein psychoanalyzed children directly instead. Her divergence from the standard psychoanalytic theory brought her many criticisms from colleagues in Berlin, leading her to feel extremely uncomfortable in the city. Melanie Klein eventually made her first book entitled The Psychoanalysis of Children, after analyzing Ernest Jones' children through his invitation, of course, and delivering a series of lectures on child analysis. Because of her divergence to the norm or standards on analysis and different ideas, she found herself not in good terms with Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. Melanie Klein made many enemies, so to speak, due to her beliefs, and one of them is her own daughter, Melita. Melita eventually became a professional of equal standing to her mother, but her antagonistic actions towards Melanie was rather personal. She hated her mother from divorcing her father, and she also blamed her mother for Hans' death, her sibling. Melita's animosity continued until Melanie's death. On the day of the funeral, Melita delivered a professional lecture wearing a flamboyant red boots as a form of insult.
Hello, I'm Karl Gelbolingo, and this is the continuation of our topic. So, the object relations theory of Melanie Klein was built on careful observations of young children, and in contrast to Freud, who emphasized the first 4 to 6 years of life, Klein stressed the importance of the first 4 to 6 months after birth. She insisted that the infant's drive, hunger, sex, and so forth are directed to an object, a breast, a penis, a vagina, and so on. Places less emphasis on biologically based drives and more importance on patterns of interpersonal relationships. It is the maternal and the human interaction as the motive for behavior and non sexual pleasure. So, first, to her, infants do not begin life with a blank slate, but with an inherited predisposition to reduce the anxiety they experience as a result of conflict produced by the forces of the life instinct and the power of the death instinct. The infant's innate readiness to act or react presupposes the existence of phylogenetic endowment, a concept that Freud also accepted. The psychic life of an infant. Fantasy. One of Klein's basic assumptions is that the infant, even at birth, possesses an active fantasy life. These fantasies are physic representations of unconscious id instincts. They should not be confused with the conscious fantasies of older children and adults. In fact, Klein intentionally spelled fantasy this way to make it distinguishable. These later unconscious fantasies are shaped by both reality and inherited predispositions. One of these fantasies involves the Oedipus complex, or the child's wish to destroy one parent and sexually possess the other. Objects. Klein agreed with Freud that humans have innate drives or instincts, including a death instinct. Drives, of course, must have some object. Klein believed that from early infancy, children relate to these external objects, both in fantasy and in reality in their active fantasy. Infants introject, or take into their psychic structure, and these introjected objects are more than internal thoughts about external objects. They are fantasies of internalizing the object in concrete and physical terms. Positions. Klein saw human infants as constantly engaging in basic conflict between the life instinct and the death instinct, that is, between good and bad, love and hate, creativity and destruction. As the ego moves toward integration and away from disintegration, infants naturally prefer gratifying sensations over frustrating ones. In their attempt to deal with this dichotomy of good and bad feelings, infants organize their experiences into positions, or ways of dealing with both internal and external objects. Klein chose the term position rather than stage of development to indicate that positions alternate back and forth. They are not periods of time or phases of development through which a person passes. Paranoid schizoid. Paranoid schizoid is a way of organizing experiences that include both paranoid feelings of being persecuted and a splitting of internal and external objects into the good and the bad. According to Klein, the infants develop the paranoid schizoid position during the first 3 or 4 months of life, during which time the ego's perception of the external world is subjective and fantastic rather than objective and real. Thus, the persecutory feelings are considered to be paranoid, that is, they are not based on any real or immediate danger from the outside world. Depressive. Beginning at about the 5th or 6th month, an infant begins to view external objects as whole and to see that good and bad can exist in the same person. At that time, the infant develops a more realistic picture of the mother and recognizes that she is an independent person who can be both good and bad at the same time. Objects are now one and the same, and the infant reproach themselves for their previous destructive urges towards their mother and desire to make reparations for these attacks. Because children now see their mother as a whole and also as being endangered, they are able to feel empathy for her, a quality that will be beneficial in their future interpersonal relations. The depressive position is resolved when children fantasize that they have made reparation for their previous transgressions, and when they recognize that their mother will not go away permanently but will return after each departure. When the depressive position is resolved, children close the split between the good and the bad mother. They're able not only to experience love from their mother, but also to display their own love for her. However, an incomplete resolution of the depressive position can result in lack of trust, morbid mourning at the loss of a loved one, and a variety of other psychic disorders. The psychic defense mechanisms. Introjection. By introjection, Klein simply meant that the infants fantasize taking into their own body those perceptions and experiences that they have had with the external object. Ordinarily, the infant tries to introject good objects to take them inside itself as a protection against anxiety. However, sometimes the infant introjects bad objects, such as the bad breast or the bad penis, in order to gain control over them. When dangerous objects are introjected, they become internal persecutors, capable of terrifying the infant and leaving frightening residues that may be expressed in dreams or in interest in fairy tales, such as The Big Bad Wolf or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. These introjected objects are not accurate representations of real objects, but are colored by children's fantasies. For example, infants will fantasize that their mother is constantly present, That is, they feel their mother is always inside their body. The real mother, of course, is not perpetually present, but infants nevertheless devour her in fantasy so that she becomes a constant internal object. Projection. Just as infants used to introject to take in both good and bad objects, they use projection to get rid of them. Projection is the fantasy that one's own feelings and impulses actually reside in another person and not within one's body. By projecting unmanageable destructive impulses onto external objects, infants alleviate the unbearable anxiety of being destroyed by dangerous internal forces. Children project both bad and good images onto external objects, especially their parents. People can also project good impulses. For example, infants who feel good about their mother's nurturing breast will attribute their own feelings of goodness onto the breast and imagine that the breast is good. And adults sometimes project their own feelings of love onto another person and become convinced that the person loves them too. Projection thus allows people to believe that their own subjective opinions are true. Splitting. Infants can only manage the good and bad aspects of themselves and of external objects by splitting them. That is, by keeping them apart in compatible impulses. In order to separate bad and good objects, the ego must itself be split. Thus, infants develop a picture of both the good me and the bad me that enables them to deal with both pleasurable and destructive impulses towards external objects. Splitting can have either a positive or negative effect on the child. If it is not extreme and rigid, it can be a positive and useful mechanism not only for infants but also for adults. It enables people to see both positive and negative aspects of themselves, and to evaluate their own behavior as good or bad, and to also differentiate between likable and unlikable acquaintance. Projective identification. This fourth one means of reducing anxiety is projective identification. Projective identification is a psychic defense mechanism in which infants split off unacceptable parts of themselves, project them into another object, and finally introject them back into themselves in a changed or distorted form. By taking the object back into themselves, infants feel that they have become like that object. That is, they identify with that object. Projective identification exerts a powerful influence on adult interpersonal relations. Unlike simple projection, which can exist wholly in fantasy, projective identification exists in the world of real interpersonal relationships. For example, a husband with strong but unwanted tendencies to dominate others will project those feelings into his wife, whom he sees as domineering. The man subtly tries to get his wife to become domineering. He behaves with excessive submissiveness in an attempt to force his wife to display the very tendencies that he has deposited into her. Internalization. Internalizations mean that the person takes and introjects aspects of the external world and then organizes those introjections into a psychologically meaningful framework. In Klein's theory, three important internalizations are the ego, the superego, and the oedipus complex. Ego. Klein believed that the ego, or oneself of sense, reaches maturity at a much earlier stage than Freud had assumed. Although Freud hypothesized that the ego exists at birth, he did not attribute complex psychic functions to it until about the third or fourth year. To Freud, the young child is dominated by the id. Klein, however, largely ignored the id and based her theory on the ego's early ability to sense both destructive and loving forces, to manage them through splitting, projection, and introjection. Klein believed that although the ego is mostly unorganized at birth, it is nevertheless is strong enough to feel anxiety, to use defense mechanisms, and to form early object relations in both fantasy and reality. The ego begins to revolve with the infant's first experience with feeding, when the good breast fills the infant not only with milk but with love and security. The infant interjects both the good breast and the bad breast, and these images provide a focal point for further expansion of the ego. However, before a unified ego can emerge, it must first become split. Klein assumed that infants innate strive for integration, but at the time they are forced to deal with the opposing forces of life and death, as reflected in their experience with the good breast and the bad breast. This dual image of self allows them to manage the good and the bad aspects of external objects. As infants mature, their perceptions become more realistic, and they no longer see the world in terms of partial objects, and their egos become more integrated. Superego. Klein's picture of the superego differs from Freud in at least three important respects. First, it emerges much earlier in life. Second, it is not an outgrowth of the Oedipus complex. And third, it is much more harsh and cruel. Klein arrived at these differences through her analysis of young children, an experience Freud did not have. To Klein, young children fear being devoured, cut up, and torn to pieces, fears that are greatly out of proportion to any realistic dangers. Why are the children's superego so drastically removed from any actual threats by their parents? Klein suggested that the answer resides with the infant's own destructive instinct, which is experienced as anxiety. To manage this anxiety, the child's ego mobilizes libido, his life instinct, or their life instinct, against the death instinct. This early ego defense lays the foundation for the development of the superego, whose extreme violence is a reaction to the ego's aggressive self-defense against its own destructive tendencies. Klein believed that this harsh, cruel superego is responsible for many antisocial and criminal tendencies in adults. Oedipus complex. Although Klein believed that her view of the Oedipus complex was merely an extension and not a refutation of Freud's ideas, her conception departed from the Freudian one in several ways. First, Klein held that the Oedipus complex began at a much earlier age than Freud had suggested. Freud believed that the Oedipus complex took place during the phallic stage, when children about 4 or 5 years old, and after they had experienced an oral or anal stage. In contrast, Klein held that the Oedipus complex begins during the earliest months of life, and overlaps with the oral and anal stages, and reaches its climax during the genital stage at around 3 or 4. Second, Klein believed that the significant part of the Oedipus complex is children's fear of retaliation from their parent for their fantasy of emptying the parent's body. Third, she stressed the importance of children retaining positive feelings toward both parents during the Oedipal years. And fourth, she hypothesized that during its early stages, the Oedipus complex serves the same need for both genders, that is, to establish a positive attitude with the good or gratifying objects and to avoid the bad or terrifying objects. Female oedipal development. At the beginning of the female oedipal development, during the first months of her life, a little girl sees her mother's breast as both good and bad. Then around 6 months of age, she begins to view the breast as more positive than negative. Later, she sees her whole mother as full of good things, and this attitude leads her to imagine how babies are made. She fantasizes that her father's penis feeds her mother with riches, including babies. Because the girl sees the father's penis as the giver of children, she develops a positive relationship to it, and fantasizes that her father will fill her body with babies. If the female oedipal stage proceeds smoothly, the girl adopts a feminine position and has positive relationship with both parents. The male oedipal development. Like the young girl, the little boy sees his mother's breast as both good and bad. Then, during the early months of oedipal development, a boy shifts some of his oral desires from his mother's breast to his father's penis. At this time, the little boy in his feminine position, that is, he adopts a passive homosexual attitude towards his father. Next, he moves to a heterosexual relationship with his mother, but because of his previous homosexual feeling for his father, he has no fear that his father will castrate him. Klein believed that this passive homosexual position is a prerequisite for the boy's development of a healthy heterosexual relationship with his mother. More simply, the boy must have a good feeling about his father's penis because before he can value his own. And as the boy matures, however, he develops oral sadistic impulses towards his father and wants to bite his penis off and murder him. These feelings arouse castration anxiety and the fear that his father will retaliate against him by biting off his own penis. This fear convinces the little boy that his sexual intercourse with his mother would be extremely dangerous to him. And in summary, Klein believed that people are born with two strong drives, the life instinct and the death instinct, and these infants develop a passionate caring for the good breast and intense hatred for the bad breast, leaving a person to struggle a lifetime to reconcile these unconscious psychic images of good and bad, pleasure and pain. The most crucial stage of life is the first few months, a time when relationships with mother and other significant objects form a model for later interpersonal relationships, and a person's adult ability to love or to hate originates with these early objects.
So, in summary, Klein's object relations theory emphasizes the importance of consistent patterns of interpersonal relationships and highlights the intimacy and nurturing of a mother. Klein believed that infants have the ability to fantasize about their own understanding of good and bad objects or scenarios regarding them. Objects in here can mean the things that is driven by their innate drives or instincts. For example, a mother's breast. Klein also proposed the concept of positions in which it organizes the feelings of an infant into good or bad, and it is divided into two: the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. So, in paranoid schizoid position, infants have these innate destructive urges and fantasies, which in turn makes him or causes him to struggle managing his or her own fears or bad feelings. In depressive position, the infant can now tolerate the delay of gratification or separation from the object that he or she is fond of. Moving on, Melanie suggested that infants have this ability to adopt psychic mechanisms like introjection, projection, splitting, and projective identification, and these are adopted in order to protect their ego against the anxiety aroused by their own destructive fantasies. On the other hand, when talking about internalizations, the Kleinian theory places emphasis on these three: the ego, superego, and oedipus complex, both female oedipal development and male oedipal development. And that is all for a quick summary of the entire discussion. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you all.